Hi, my name is Miško Hevery. I'm founder of AngularJS.
And I'm Brad Green, and I will play Angular's manager today. That's what I do. All right, so we wanted to take some time in front of you folks, thanks for coming, by the way, talking about what it is that drove us to build Angular. Because we think when people come and look at the Angular framework, a lot of times they see the features of Angular, and maybe we weren't very clear about what we meant. When they come to see the features, they see what we call the 3 Ds. Directives, dependency injection, and data binding. But we're passionate about some very different things. We just happen to arrive at these features along the way. So Miško, why don't you talk a little bit about what it is you care most about in web development?
So web development, if you think about it, is all about getting data to the browser and back to the database. And so one of the things you end up doing is a whole lot of boilerplate marshalling of the data back and forth. And after you build a couple of web applications, you're just getting tired of writing the same thing over and over again. And it's kind of getting in the way of just building the actual stuff. And so boilerplate is one of the things we really wanted to eliminate as much as possible inside of our code base.
Right. So we thought that if we could distill our apps, if we could boil them down maybe, to their essence, about just what actually adds value to the app, then it'd be very much, it's easier to build these applications, but also easier to understand. We spend a lot more time reading code than writing it, so we thought that would be cool.
So the next thing is, every single application I've ever been on, it was structured in some other way. And having a common way of structuring the application means that developers can easily come up to speed on your code base and can easily move between projects. And so giving structure to the application is another important thing.
What is that shape, Miško?
That's a scaffolding, sir.
Do you know how to draw a scaffold, Miško?
No, I do not get paid to draw. I get paid to write code.
Okay, good thing, good thing.
And then lastly, I'm a big fan of testability, and so we put a lot of testing effort into our framework. But it's not enough to just build a framework which itself is tested. It's all about making sure that the developers writing code using the framework will have easy time testing. And so one of the things we wanted to make sure is the way the framework is structured naturally leads you down the testability path.
That's right, and we believe that if you're shipping software, you better be shipping tested software, so we really wanted to make that easy. So let's go back a few years to 2009, where I think I said, Miško, you should go learn JavaScript. This seems like the new thing. And what did you do? What was your first inclination as a newbie in the world of JavaScript? What did you do?
Well, write a framework, right? What else would you do?
That's right. Every newbie should write a framework. It's a good policy.
So the idea behind Angular, original Angular, was actually a little different, which was that there's a lot of web designers out there, people who are not really programmers, developers per se, but they know how to put HTML together because it's so declarative and it's easy to do. And so could we enable the web designers to be able to build a very trivial, simple applications just by dropping a little bit of extra markup logic into the HTML so that you don't even have to manage your backend. You have some database in the cloud, and you include the script tag, put a little bit of extra tags, and all of a sudden your form becomes persistable form and can send email and things of that sort.
That's right. You had this eye-stabbingly yellow logo, right?
You have something against yellow?
It got better.
All right.
All right, so fast forward just a little bit to, we were on a project together, and I remember Miško, this is a project called Google Feedback. And Miško, you and the other developers on the project were kind of unhappy with our development pace.
Yes, the velocity was not so great. We spent about 6 months, 3 of us, working on this particular project. 17,000 lines of code later, we were really not making the progress we wanted to make. And so we're frustrated. And so in my frustration, I went to Brad and I said, Brad, I'm working on this thing in my free time, kind of an open source project, and I bet you I could rewrite the whole thing in 2 weeks.
And I said, go for it, because 2 weeks, whatever. But I don't think you quite made it in 2 weeks.
No, I didn't make it in 2 weeks. It took me 3 weeks. And 1,500 lines of code later, we actually have rewritten the whole application.
I was impressed. And this was kind of the start where I thought, well, Angular seems like it could be a thing unto itself. Not just a part of Google Feedback as the way it was. And this is where we decided we would spin it off into its own entity.
So what exactly is it to build a single-page application? Well, you have a database, and you have the browser, and the stuff in the middle is really what we're talking about, right? And so to have a single-page application is really all about modifying the DOM. The divs, the spans, the ULs, the LIs, the tables, and so forth. You need to transfer it from one state to another state, because that essentially is going to drive the rendering engine. But the thing that's different between round-trip applications and single-page applications is that you have to deal a lot of it about the internal thing called RAM?
Memory.
Memory,
We call it
I
memory
see.
these days, yeah.
So the heap of the program, right? So instead of getting the data in line with your HTML, you get data separately, you load it into the memory, and now the problem becomes, once we get it in memory, is how do we get it to the DOM? And then back when the user interacts into the memory and into the database. And so our passion really became, how do we simplify this flow of data to the DOM and back to the database? And this is essentially what became Angular.
Right, we've got a better logo. But let's see a little bit how this works. And we're going to go to an example of the basics of moving data back and forth. And this is one of those 3 Ds. And we'll actually describe them, not our goals, but it's important. So data binding, the way this works, we've got just in a template, we're actually able to express kind of an interesting case. So let's actually see how this works before we dive into the code. So Miško has a text box here, and you notice as he types, the words that he types appears below, and the word hi appears when there's something in the box. So if he deletes all the text in the box, the word hi goes away, and we don't see anything. So let's go back and take a look at how this works. So at the top, you notice in the HTML tag, we have an extra attribute that is not actually part of the HTML spec. And all these things in green are these extensions we've added, and we call them directives. But they allow us to assemble the application in interesting ways. And here on the input field, what we've said is that the model for our data, the place in memory where this lives, we're going to name it with an object called user, and we have a property called name. And that we want these things synced up, so that whenever somebody types that in memory, it should update this user.name, and we can use that elsewhere. So right below it, in the paragraph tag, we want to place that text. So what we do in double curlies, we call this interpolation. We're able to place that text right in there just by putting those double curlies in. This is a familiar syntax that's used in other templating languages. But we're also able to use it not only to modify what data is there, but to control whether it's shown or hidden. So in the P tag, we have ng-show equals username. And what this says is that showing and hiding should be controlled by presence of text in there. If there's no text, hide it. If there's text, show it.
But we got an interesting eureka moment in here, which is that our templating system was actually HTML, which means you could use all of your existing HTML editors, such as Dreamweaver or your HTML editor inside of your IDE. And this is in stark contrast to most other templating systems that happen to be templating languages of their own that just happen to produce HTML on the end. This is actually HTML all the way through. And that makes it easy for people to pick up and learn, such as for web developers, for web designers who are already familiar with the HTML paradigm.
That's right, but data binding isn't the whole story, right? Like we also want to put in some other bits when we create an application.
So at the beginning, I mentioned that the idea was, could I build a very simple web application without having any kind of logic inside of, without having to write any logic, any program, just by using data binding? And if you wanted to build a real application, sooner or later you come to the situation where, well, you have to put the logic in there. And so it's not sufficient to just have a good data binding story, but also have a good story about how do we manage all of the code that has to be written, and how does the code interact with the data binding as well.
That's right. Let's take a look at another example. So here we've got a slightly more complex example where we've got 2 files, one index.html on the left and usercontroller.js on the right. And again, let's take a look at how this works before we walk through the code. So Miško is going to open his second tab, and we've got a text input. We've got the word Larry in there, and when he clicks the buy button, it says buy Larry. Nothing too complex. But if he changes the text and clicks buy, it updates to use Google I/O as the text. OK, let's take a look at how we do this. So now we need some logic. We need some way to take that text that somebody typed and move it somewhere we can use in our buy button. So our template on the left-hand side, we're adding another piece to the template. We are now telling Angular to construct a template that relates to some code. In this case, we're specifying that a class called userController we're going to use to manage this part of the DOM. And this is some new syntax. So for people who have used Angular before, this is some new syntactic sugar we'll be releasing tomorrow. But we're able to create an alias for userController. We're just going to call it uControl. And then we can refer to it later. And what we'll see is that we can put attributes on uControl that we want to access as part of our model. So the input will bind to uControl.user.first. And for clicking the button, when users click it, we'll specify an ng click there that uControl should call the by function that we defined there on the right-hand side.
But I wanted to point out something over here, which is that the user controller has no access to the DOM. There's also no special thing you have to inherit from, no special way that you have to instantiate your model other than a regular object. And notice there's no API one has to call inside of Angular. This is really just a plain old JavaScript type that exists in JavaScript.
Right, and maybe even more importantly, notice that there's no new. We never call new on user controller. We don't create it. Just by specifying in the ng controller tag, Angular knows enough to create it at the right moment when this view comes into my application. It creates a controller and attaches it, or it hands it the right things in the DOM.
Right. So when you have a model view controller, in Angular, really everything is driven by the view on the left-hand side over here. And the view says, I need the controller, and so that instantiation of the controller has to happen, which then goes ahead and instantiates the model. Now, the thing to notice over here is that all of the arrows point away from the view and into the controller or the model. And because the arrows point in this particular direction, it means that one doesn't have to start with the view. One can start with instantiating the controller and the model separately, and this is very wonderful in tests. And also, this allows you to easily reskin your application for different devices.
Right, and what this really means is that my view and my controller and my model are decoupled, meaning I could change the view with the same business logic and the same model for maybe different devices or different use cases.
Right.
So Miško, so let's talk about how this assembly of the application actually works then.
So here we're taking a simple case which we just saw with the hello world and making it a little more complicated by saying instead of popping up a dialog box, maybe we could use a voice synthesis to actually say the words that we're about to display in the alert box. So in this case, we again need to have a user controller, but notice the user controller says it needs voice synth. And below we have a definition of what synth might look like, which then uses the web audio to actually speak to generate the text and speak it through the speakers. Now, the thing to notice over here is that the view says it needs a user controller. And the dependency injection system then tries to instantiate the controller, but it notices, but in order to get the user controller going, I need to have a voice synth object. So then it goes one level lower and says, OK, and let me make one of the voice synth. But again, it sees, well, I need a web audio. So it goes one level further yet, and it instantiates web audio. Hopefully, that has no dependencies. And then it takes the web audio instance, puts it inside of the voice synth instance, which then is placed inside of the user controller instance. And the whole controller is then handed over to the view.
So, but let's talk a little bit about how this actually works. Like, nowhere in my user controller do I actually directly refer to voice synth.
That's right. So normally when you have a constructor parameter such as over here, those don't matter. I mean, they're only there for the user, for the developer to kind of understand what's going on. But in our case, we actually look at the actual text, and we use the voice synth key to match it up against the voice synth class so that we can instantiate it.
Right, very cool. Now, this is great for building my app and rearranging my app. If I go to refactor my application, this is cool. But it's also great in testing.
That's right. So let's say we wanted to test this thing. So first of all, we probably don't want to instantiate the whole HTML DOM. That's expensive. So we'll start a layer lower, and we're going to say, well, let's just instantiate user controller. But tests don't hear. They don't have ears.
They hear very poorly.
Yes. And so what we'd really like to do is replace the voice synth, the actual voice synthesizer, with a voice synth mock. And so what we're really trying to tell the dependency injection system is that we're going to change the recipe by which you build the application slightly so that we can get a subset of the application going, configured in a slightly different way. And once we get this subset, it's very easy to apply stimulus to it and assert that the right methods got called on a voice synth.
Right. OK, let's take a minute and step back and talk about what have we got so far.
So we have this imperative world, and we have this declarative world. Imperative world being, let's say I wanted to center something. In imperative world, you have to compute the width of the page, the width of the thing you want to center, divided by half to get the midpoint, align the midpoints, and then render the text that you want. The trouble with this way of doing it is that when somebody else comes afterwards and looks at the code, they have to kind of reverse engineer what is the side effect of this piece of code. Declarative is, on the other hand, is you simply say, I want to center this thing. And it doesn't matter where the implementation is. And actually, the concept of centering might actually be implemented slightly differently on different browsers, as long as the end result is the same thing. And so Up to now, usually when you have a framework, the developers really are just handed over and say, you get to use this imperative thing. This is you can play with it any way you want. But this declarative thing, we'll have the framework give you some vocabulary for the declarative stuff, but it's essentially fixed. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could take this vocabulary and extend it? And this was our aha moment in saying, you know, why are we in some way special that we can create the vocabulary but the developer can't? What if we gave the same tools to the developer as well? And so we have a little change in Angular in that the developer gets to use the imperative or gets to use the declarative world depending on what they feel like is the best way to solve this particular problem.
That's right. Let's take a look at some examples. So we've seen how directives can be used to express the way we wire our application together with ng-model and ng-controller, and the way we change the structure of the DOM with ng-show, as we saw. But you can also use it to create reusable components. For example, if I wanted maybe a star rating component, I could, after implementing it, then just use it in my template by saying angle bracket rating, and then pass the data to it that it needs through its attributes. You can create more complex things where you've got nested or other components that need to collaborate. For example, a set of tabs will have the information about which one is highlighted and which one should I paint with a box around it, and then the individual tabs inside would contain the title and the content. You can also do it not just by element name, but also by attribute name. And so you can create things like a tooltip where you could place it on a span or on a tabs or on a rating or anything else in the UI. OK. We've covered kind of the basics in Angular. And now let's take us back to the way we were kind of creating apps before we wrote the Angular framework. We weren't using jQuery, but we're going to use jQuery here because we feel like a lot of folks know it. We've got a simple application Miško is going to show us.
It says you're going to tap dance, but you got no shoes.
I took them off because I knew that line was in there. Then we're going to rewrite the application in Angular and show some of the differences.
So here's a very simple application. All it really does is it shows you a list of projects. And what you can do is you can add, and it brings you to the detail view. Notice when I click the add, it's a single-page application. The URL didn't actually change, the same URL. I can say something over here, hit save, and now I have my new item inside of the list. I can further click on it and delete it.
I should mention there is a very simple RESTful server running a node on the back end here that we use to persist the projects.
Exactly. So really, it's just an application with 2 views, very simple. And what's strange about this thing is that it takes me 2 sentences to explain what it does, yet it takes me about 200 lines of both HTML and JavaScript to actually implement this. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect over there. So what does this look like? Well, so this is a list of projects. And in this case, we have a template, which is a table. And inside of a table head, we have this plus on the right-hand side. And notice what we have to do here. We have to say, well, there's a link, so that it looks like a link, but actually, it actually goes nowhere. Inside of JavaScript later on, I'll show you we basically have to set up a click listener, and we have to prevent the default behavior of the browser, which is to navigate to a link, and actually just modify the DOM to render the details page. And this is kind of it kind of breaks the paradigm of what a web application is supposed to be. And so we'll show you how Angular can make better usage of this thing. The other thing is that in the table row, the same kind of a click has to happen, but there's it isn't clear where the text goes inside of here. And so we actually have to get a hold of this thing from the JavaScript side as well. We do something similar for the form for the details view. So let's have a look at how is this implemented in JavaScript. So the first thing you're going to notice is that there's a tremendous number of selectors that have to get executed in order to get a hold of the right pieces of the DOM. And what these selectors essentially end up doing is they essentially creating the arrow going the opposite direction from the code to the view. That creates coupling, and it makes it difficult for a web designer to come in and move things around and not break the CSS selectors that select them.
Even if we're using IDs, it's still fragile. It's still something that you have to be careful about when you move things around.
That's right. And so this basically shows you how we render the page on the right-hand side. So we have this show method where what it does is, well, it has to assume that there might have been a different page before, so it has to remove the existing content. It has to add its template to it. It has to remove any existing projects that happen to be inside of the template before. And it has to set up this click listener, which I mentioned briefly before, which does the navigation from one page to another. We then go and do an AJAX to the server, and for each project, we basically do clone of the table row, write the data into the right locations, And again, we have to set up a click listener, which transitions us from the detail view to the, from the list view to the detail view. And so what's lost in the process over here is it's not clear what this thing actually does. There's tons of DOM manipulation, and the actual business logic of this particular page is lost in here.
So, all right, so let's fast forward and let's re-implement it in Angular. Let's see how it's different.
So let's look at the template again. What we have done is we have removed the templates from index.html and replaced them with something called a view. So this is essentially a hole into which individual pages will be loaded. And the actual pages got moved into a separate file.
Now this template, the top of the template right now, if this was a more complex application, this is where we would put maybe our top nav or our left-hand nav. But here it's simple. We just have one view that we swap in and out.
Exactly. Now notice, instead of registering a click listener for this ahref, we let the ahref do what the web does best, which is create links. So in this case, we're saying, look, there is a sub-view of this particular page, which is the /project with no ID, and this is what's tied to the URL. So now if I reload this application and I click on the plus, notice that the URL has changed. Now the nice side effect of this is that all of a sudden our back and forwards button just work without really any effort whatsoever.
Now we could have done that in the jQuery version, just a lot more work.
We could have done it, it would be a lot more work, but this is a model that people are very familiar with, developers are very familiar with, because it's the kind of a round-trip application model, except that round-tripping all happens in the browser. There's no actual round-tripping. This is still a single-page application that we have here. So the next thing to notice is that instead of manually making clones of the table row, we have this other directive called an ng-repeat, which basically says for each project in the list of projects, and I'll explain where the list of projects comes in a second, we just want to have a copy of a TR. And this does the copying and cloning and managing it automatically. The next thing is that all of the double curlies shown over here naturally show us where things belong, so we don't have to have selectors to place them there. And finally, again, we have an example of deep linking where if you want to click on an edit button, it just means that we want to update the URL with a specific ID in the URL that becomes bookmarkable. And again, all the magic of bookmarks happens automatically for us. So let's look at how this changes inside of the JavaScript. And this is the goal that we were after, which was, if I want to explain to somebody what this particular page does, it's just as simple as saying, give me a list of projects. It's a single sentence, and I want this to be a single statement inside of my code as well. So in this case, we're saying we have a project list controller. There's a single item in there. Now, so how did we know to load this particular controller? Well, if we look over here, this is where we set up routes. We're saying we're emulating kind of a round-trip application, but in the browser. So we have to say that when the URL, which is shown right here, is a regular slash, we activate the project list controller and the project list template. And so the project list controller simply says, go to the database and fetch me a project query.
OK, so something interesting going on here we should explain. When we query, we're actually connecting to the database. But you notice there's no callbacks there. What's really going on, Miško?
So this is the place where we get to take advantage of data binding in a very unique way. So project.query does essentially an XHR in the background. And the way it does this is that it returns immediately, but it returns an empty set because the server will respond in some future point in time with the actual data set. And it takes that empty array and just assigns it to the project so that when the ng-repeat gets notified to say, hey, I have a new data for you inside of the projects, it simply says, oh, there's nothing there, and therefore it renders nothing. But at some future point in time, the data actually does show up and updates the same instance of the array, which then automatically causes the ng-repeat to unroll itself and make as many copies of a project as you have. So in a simple situation where all you need is to fetch some data and render it, we can actually bypass the whole need to have a callback. Now the second thing is, well, where did the project come from? This is where dependency injection comes in, and this is how the application actually gets assembled, which we kind of mentioned that earlier. So right above here, it says a project can be made by using something called a resource. A resource is just a service in Angular that we can use to build JavaScript types for RESTful backend services. So we're just saying this is going to be a standard RESTful object, which we can just use query on to fetch the data set. And again, notice that the application gets automatically assembled for us. So just simply by navigating to the right URL causes the right route to be activated, which then activates the right controller, which then knows to go and make a new project, which then knows to build the project using the resource, and the whole application gets assembled without us ever having to do any of this stuff. Similarly, inside of the project details controller, we can simply say, show me an existing project or a new project, depending on whether we have an ID or not.
So how many lines of code are we at?
So we are about 40 lines of code, and we actually added a new behavior because we have deep linking available for us.
OK, that's very cool. OK, as your manager, however, I need to ask you to add more features to this application.
More features,
Miško, could you please add more features?
What feature would you like to add?
OK, well, okay, so this is a list of projects, probably frameworks. People like to write frameworks, as we know. It could get long. How about add the ability to filter how many frameworks are there if I want to search for the one I want?
So the first thing you need to add is an input box, right? So if I refresh now, I have an input box, and if I type into it, this text actually ends up in the memory location called search text. Now we need to do something with this particular case. Now one of the things we have, and I'm sure you're familiar with in Unix, is the concept of filters, which we have as well using a simple pipe character. And we can run it through kind of a special miniatized functions. In this case, there's a function called filter. I know the naming is a bit confusing.
Nice name, yeah.
But what a filter does is just looks through the list of objects in an array and sees if any of the objects happen to have a text inside of it that matches the search text criteria inside of the input box. And so now if I refresh this, you will see that as I type the word web, it will show only those projects that actually have the word web inside of them. Notice how the repeater automatically grows and shrinks as the filtering changes.
OK, very cool. However, modern applications use animation to give me a more intuitive sense of what's going on. Could you maybe animate the items in the list in and out?
Do you understand how complicated animations are?
I don't. I'm a manager.
I see. So animations, as you guys all know, I'm sure are complex things because you have to add things to the DOM before they actually come onto stage. Then you have to transition them, have to keep track of timers, remove things, and so on. And this is where the power of declarative world really comes from, because really what I want to express when I'm building the application is there is something called animation, right? And I want to animate this thing using a slide animation. A slide animation is just something I've declared inside of my CSS as, this is the set of transitions we want to apply to the system. But actually managing the DOMs, adding, removing, setting the classes at the right time is actually managed by this ng-animate directive. So let's refresh this. And notice, as I type web now, it removes and adds item in the correct way with just a couple of keystrokes.
Sassy, very sassy. All right, so we're kind of at the end of our coding portion. Miško has, however, added some other interesting features, also in this sort of declarative way, but we'll just demo them. And you can go to the GitHub repository. We'll give you a link at the end of the session. But you can also do things like animate between views. So if I was on a mobile device, I'd want to be able to slide back and forth. We've also done form validation. So you can have things that are required or that are not only required, but they have to be in a specific regex format, like something must be a URL. And these things, as I mentioned, we can add in also a purely declarative way. These are well-understood problems. We can just put them in the template. All right, so we should talk about a couple of the things before we wrap up. One of the things that people tell us is fantastic about Angular, besides the framework, is the community. And there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of folks in the community who do a great job of helping each other, documenting new things in Angular, adding code, all kinds of things. There are meetups that happen regularly. There are on our Google group, on Twitter, on Stack Overflow, on Google+. There's a tremendous community. There's an IRC channel that's very active, too. As you can see from the map, there are actually still some places in the world where we would love to see monthly meetups, and we'd love to help you make these happen. Let's go next. So the rest of the ecosystem, Angular kind of fits a small piece of the whole web development puzzle. And I think this is kind of cool because it's made space for other people to create things that fit in the world. We've developed some of them, but a lot of other folks have created things too. So in the world of tools, one of the things that we created is a Chrome Developer Tools plugin called Battering. And Battering lets you visualize your application, visualize your data bindings, your, where your template is set up, optimize the performance, and debug it for all of the Angular-specific concepts. The good folks over at WebStorm have created a plugin that makes it Angular syntax aware, and a lot of us use WebStorm on the team because of it. We've been working with Adi Osmani and Paul Irish and the other folks on Yeoman to make it very easy to scaffold an Angular application, to update its dependencies, and then to build and deploy it when you're ready. And then one of our team members, Vojta, has done something that I think is extra special. We talk a lot about testing, but making the framework testable was not a full story. He wrote a test runner called Karma. And Karma, we think, is the fastest, most reliable, easiest test runner on the planet. Matter of fact, I would say it would change your life. We should do a demo of that later, but it's awesome. Go download it. Search for Karma Test Runner. It's awesome. Now, when we were talking about directives, we said that you can write your own things like star ratings and tabs and tooltips, and it turns out a lot of you don't want to be doing that. And so there are a ton of directives, web components, that you can just use. And we have things like the Angular UI project. It's not part of Angular, but they've collected a number of the web components from across the web, and there's specifically a Twitter Bootstrap-themed set of components. There are also commercial versions, like Kendo UI and Weejmo. So you can come out of the box with a whole bunch of components that you just snap together like Legos in your template. In the rest of the world of libraries, there are things like Breeze.js that gives you a very rich set of tools for manipulating data that comes from SQL and NoSQL databases. If you want a database in the cloud, there's Firebase, who've created Angular-specific bindings so that you can use them with our data binding system. And the folks at Salesforce have recently created a developer tools pack that lets you create Angular applications with Salesforce on the back end on mobile devices. And then there's books. I wrote one of them, the one with the fish. I think that is the most handsome of the books. But I think last count, there were 7 books. Really, you should buy them all. I could not choose. All right. So thank you, everybody. Thanks so much. At the lower right-hand side is the link for our GitHub repository for the demos that you saw today. Miško and I are available on Twitter and Google+ if you want to reach out to us. We're going to be in the Chrome sandbox upstairs for the next half hour. We've got a little bit of time for questions, but we'll be there. We'd love to answer questions. We've got some stickers to hand out upstairs. And then Angular folks are going to be in that Chrome sandbox area on Thursday and Friday all day long. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. So let's go over here at the mic.
So good to see Angular at I/O.
Thank you.
So my question is, how do you configure the curly braces for data binding? That is configurable, right? I'm using Jekyll with liquid templates, and there are curly braces used there as well, so I'd like to be able to configure that. And do you recommend against that?
Yes, so there is a interpolation provider, which allows you to configure the starting and ending set of sequence of characters that will do this. And so you can use that. The caveat is that if you're using a third-party library or third-party widget library that assumes curly braces, you might break them. It's not true? Oh, we compensate. Oh, we fix it now. Okay.
Okay, good.
So you can change it using
It just works.
It just works.
Thank you, Igor.
Great, thanks.
All right, sure.
I come from China as a Zhuhai GDG organizer. So I noticed that a map pocket all the AngularJS community. Mm-hmm. But in fact, AngularJS.syn is building just use AngularJS. In fact, in the China is very so many people love AngularJS. So my question is, how make the AngularJS community and you can address you can know it. I just want to single you map. You know that question?
I'm kind of
My
missing the
question
question.
is,
I think he's saying that there is an
we
awesome
already
JavaScript.
You're saying in China there's a fantastic JavaScript community
yes,
and there's AngularJS going on.
scene, but we lost in your map. So I question why.
Tell me where it should go and I will put it on my map.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay.
Yes, that would be awesome. Thank you.
How is Google using AngularJS internally? Are there any apps that we use or consume?
Yeah, we built a lot of internal apps on Angular. Google Feedback was one of them. The two big external applications that we've built on top of it is DoubleClick, which makes some money for Google. This is display advertising. I mean, a lot, actually. And then YouTube has built their, it's kind of like an embedded in the PlayStation 3 application. So the live player that you get with PlayStation 3, that's built in Angular. There's some more stuff on the way. Can't pre-announce.
Yeah, because that's always a concern that you guys keep using it so that it keeps growing, right?
Indeed, indeed. It's well loved within Google.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And over here.
First question is, the query, it does have a callback though, right, if I need it?
That's right, you can have a callback if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, for catching errors, and there's some other reasons you might want to.
And secondly, within Google, is there any sort of internal fight with Backbone?
There is actually no fight with Backbone internal to Google.
Yeah, no.
No, there's none.
Okay.
None whatsoever.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, yes. I just started using Angular for the first time, actually, a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you.
And
Awesome.
I absolutely freaking love it.
Thank you.
Next question. Awesome.
The search functionality, it's really nice, but can you talk a little bit about patterns to use when like the data set is big and it needs to be paged in and out, and you know what's the right way of setting up your services?
I think that's way beyond what we can answer on stage in 30
Yeah,
seconds.
I mean, I can point you, there are several services that help doing this, help doing the pagination and doing sort of an infinite scroll effect, which is what folks often want.
But the search, the actual search, right? The NG search stuff. Not just the scrolling, but the actual.
Yeah. So that as you type, you want it like the Google homepage.
Yeah, even if I set up like a back-end search stuff.
As Miško says, there are some details. Maybe come up to the Chrome sandbox. I'd love to chat about it.
That's a better way of. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, over here.
Okay, first of all, thank you for making Angular. It saved my bacon like 2 months ago making a site. It's really awesome.
Thank you.
Two questions. First, what are your recommendations towards search engine optimization for sites built with Angular?
Yes.
And the other one is, I'm currently trying to get a site done in Angular, but the manager is concerned about users who don't have JavaScript enabled or
What year is this again?
don't really have it. So
I think it's 2002, but no. So I can't help your manager because he is living somewhere else. But as far as what was the first question?
SEO. So the
SEO,
is,
yes. So there's a recipe for doing SEO. There's a website called Year of Moo. There's this guy named Matthias who worked with us on the animation directives, actually. And he has a very good documented path for doing this. Search for Year of Moo, Angular SEO.
Okay. It has to do with the headless, what is it called?
Using Phantom.js to kind of render
Phantom.js,
your
yes.
pages, yeah.
okay, and that wouldn't be penalized by you guys as Google because
No.
since users are being
there's no way
served-
for Google to know.
Okay.
Right? We see what you finally render.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
So we already built an app with Backbone and all this stuff, and we don't. It's like a financial app. So now, do you think I can introduce Angular and will this help? Because it's a huge app, the trading app with a lot of Backbone and a lot of stuff in it. So
What is the core of the question? Could you rewrite it in Angular?
I mean, do I have
Should
to
you?
whole rewrite something, or will it? Can I use this as a part of it, or how will this help?
Yeah, I think
for
it's
an
asking,
existing app?
does it do a full rewrite or you can do it partially?
Yes,
And
yes.
one of the things we wanted to make sure that Angular plays nicely with other frameworks so that you could like rewrite an app, you know, one page at a time or something like that. So, and there's even, I've seen some blog posts about people trying to get Angular to run together with Backbone. So they use Backbone for the models and Angular for their data binding and rendering. So that should be possible.
Possible. Yeah, because we use data binding a lot with the backbones. Thanks.
I think we have time for one more question and the time is running out.
Yes, right over here, and then we'll hit the rest of you up in the sandbox.
All right. All right, score for me. So I actually have been using it for the past half a year and loving it. I have two very specific questions about ng switch. So one of them is lately I've been doing a lot of nested ng switches, one inside, like for instance, one is true, and inside that another ng switch, and sometimes a third. Should I be concerned about doing nested ng switch? That's question number one.
If you're just going to nest just a few ng switches, it shouldn't be an issue. If you're going to nest 50 of them, then maybe you should look at a different way of doing it.
Yeah, okay. It's good to know. So the second one is there a good way to do undefined with ng switch? Because I haven't been able to do that very successfully. So what I always have been doing is to actually have a wrapper to return true or false, and then have it go to one branch, one true, and then one false, versus when I try to do one undefined, it just doesn't seem to fall to the right branch. So I'm not sure if anybody else has seen a similar problem.
I didn't quite get it, but maybe let's continue this back upstairs.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.